Hello.
Hi, everyone.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Environmental Podcast.
Yeah, this is our podcast where we investigate different aspects of sustainability. We choose a topic every month and we just investigate it and talk about it with you, well, each other, to you.
Yeah, you're involved.
You're involved.
Yes. Yes. And this month we are continuing our dive into energy overall, but more so we are focused on renewable energy and the renewable transition.
Yeah, I'm actually really glad to be done talking about fossil fuels and the fossil fuel industry.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, the past 4 weeks we've uh, driven ourselves a little crazy doing as much research as we did into the fossil fuel industry and all of, um, I guess, the history of that and just kind of understanding how we got where we are now.
Yeah, and actually where we are now, because there's not a consensus in the world about where we actually stand in terms of energy. So we've been kind of diving into that a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, it is a bit of a mystery. Yeah. And, as environmentalists, um, it's common to hear like, yeah, let's just transition to renewables. Let's just
Yeah.
do it. Like today. What are we waiting for? And but we knew it was more complex than that.
Yeah, we we are
Nothing's that simple. Yeah.
nothing is that simple, and we both have a roots in interdisciplinary issues and systems. So this is something that we find really interesting, and we want to kind of pick it apart and say, like, what can we do and what can't we do. I wasn't really expecting that feeling here, but I'm excited to learn more about that aspect of okay, what actually needs to happen.
Right. Right. Yeah, because it's no longer conceptual. It's like, no, we need
Right.
to make some real tangible solutions like
Right
right now. Yeah.
now. Yeah,
And they're complex
they are.
and we, yeah, kind of can't rely on the current status quo to like be in charge of making the decisions for the future because that the way that things are working right now is inherently unsustainable.
Right. Right. Yeah.
So that's been an interesting thing to kind of like see that, like there's a lot to sort of that we'll have to undo
Mhm.
to progressively move forward.
Totally.
And
That
yeah,
Yeah.
we'll dive into that a bit today.
Yeah. So this week we split up. We did it a couple of weeks ago and actually really enjoyed splitting up topics and then kind of presenting information to each other. So Courtney went first last time, so I'm going to go first this time.
It's your turn. Yeah.
It's my turn, I guess.
Yeah.
And I looked into the transition and what it means and where we are. Um, and then Courtney looked into more conceptual where we need to go and what that looks like
Mhm.
information. So, um, wow, where we're at right now is sort of a mess.
Oh,
um,
you don't
yeah,
say.
I am saying. So, it is true that we are gaining traction as it relates to migrating from fossil fuels into choosing more renewable energy sources. And what's really interesting to me is that, well, there's a couple of things here, and I got this specific information from Vox. They did a really incredible investigative piece, and I'll share that link obviously when we post. Um, that while we're gaining traction, especially with renewable energy in terms of electricity, we aren't really doing very well with renewables in terms of like like replacing fossil fuels, which is to say traveling and heating and cooling your house.
Yeah.
Those two pieces are huge as it relates to emissions. But one thing I found really interesting about the Vox article was that they used the term renewable energy capacity. We actually have a massive capacity for using renewables. Like, so it could be something like 60%. We can use 60% capacity for our electricity, but we're not using that much.
Are you saying, sorry, just to be clear, are you saying like we could use 60%
We have the
renewable?
capacity.
We have the
Yeah.
capacity to power 60% of our power renewably.
Basically, yes, but we're not doing that. We haven't started transitioning our actual energy consumption yet. Now, that article was in 2018, so there has been
Yeah.
some updates since then, but it still holds true in general that like what we can do and what we are doing are two separate things and they're two different conversations. So
Interesting.
I
Okay.
thought that was really interesting because you see like, oh yeah, like you can't you can do 60% of your electricity off of solar, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's what a city or a country is doing.
Right. Right.
Um,
Yeah. So there's a breakdown somewhere happening.
yeah.
Mhm,
Um, a lot of it is just general growing pains and like actually transitioning there.
mhm.
Other things is like storage, which I'll talk about in a minute. What else I find really interesting that connects with a little bit what we talked about last week is that actually China is, in terms of like raw numbers, leading the charge, especially in solar. And I just put like a note here that says, is that because they have the mines to like
Yeah.
build to like mine the
Makes
elements?
sense. Yeah,
If
yeah,
that
yeah.
Yeah.
They are the main global source of those elements, so that
Right.
are
So it
necessary
makes
in
sense.
creating solar panels. Yeah,
Right. They're also being built there. So it
makes
makes
sense.
sense.
And good for them that to be implementing that rather than just like
Right.
selling it out. Yeah, okay.
Right.
Right on.
It's not where it needs to be. A really interesting quote here is as of 2017, fossil fuels were still providing about 80% of humanity's energy, which is the same as they've been providing for decades. It's unchanged. Um, yeah. So there's a huge shift that needs to happen. We are in the stage of building the capacity for it to happen, but haven't transitioned into using that. I'm choosing to like think of it as like we're building the ability and then
Yeah,
we're going to transition to that ability, which I think is the smart way to do it without
yeah.
making like huge shifts that are going to just be like
Ye-
impossible.
Right, right. It has to be incremental. Yeah.
Yeah.
If you're, it's such a big lifestyle shift that like,
Yeah.
or it could be if we didn't do it thoughtfully and actually like ensured
Yeah,
that we had the
exactly.
capacity to meet everyone's needs. Yeah.
Right, which yeah, we're working on now.
Yeah.
Um, some interesting and just other information from that article is that fossil fuel subsidies are still double what renewables are, and a huge part of the problem here is that there isn't enough funding to figure out what the tech should be. That's something that we talked about last week, but just like now that we've transitioned to looking at the other side of the same issue is like seeing that again and seeing like, oh, because last week we talked about how big the subsidies were, and this week it's kind of like those subsidies are double.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Fossil fuel subsidies are double what renewables are getting, but
Yeah, what's up
we
with
have a
that?
lot of talk around this transition. Um, yeah. I also learned the word energy intensity. Did you see that when you were doing your research? I saw it a couple of times.
Not to my knowledge, no.
Energy intensity. It's like, and so I went down a rabbit hole of like, what does that mean? But it's set against energy efficiency. So I looked at energy.gov and the official, there's a whole lot of definitions for it, but the official definition is that it's measured by the quantity of energy required per unit output or activity. So using less energy to produce a product reduces energy intensity. Yeah. And
Okay.
then
It seems like it's the opposite. Yeah, it's the
it's
opposite
the
of
opposite of
efficiency.
energy efficiency.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
one of our biggest issues is that we are very, especially in the States and in parts of Europe, we are very energy intensive. We don't have efficient solutions yet. And that is one of the huge ways we need to change,
Mm.
you know?
Mm-hmm.
But one of the issues, oh, wow, there's a
It's
human
okay.
at my door. Hello.
That's okay. We can hear Maven. It's okay.
Maven doing barking. We have strangers coming to our house. Okay.
Construction worker.
She feels the
Good.
stress
Yeah.
in living in a construction zone. I don't blame her.
I don't blame her. Yeah. This
Oh,
is
there's actually someone here. Okay. Um, so one of the things I found this article and it's a little sidelined, but I think it fits in really well here. It's from resilience.org and it's written by Richard Heinberg. And it's essentially, he said, the point of this article, and actually a lot of what Richard Heinberg says, I did some extra like digging, is about how there is no plan. I don't know if you noticed this, Cord, but there like is no actual plan.
yeah.
There's like lots of stuff and there's
Lots of
lots of information and there's
hypotheses.
lots of noise,
Yeah.
but there's no integrated plan with related policies, investments, or piloting. That's a quote from him. And I felt that so strongly because like we've been looking into this for a while now, and at no point have we ever actually seen a plan that was global or even really like statewide,
Right. Mm-hmm.
which feels crazy. Now, like, and reading it from this article was like, oh, okay. I thought I was just missing it. Um, but the deeper I look into this, the more I realize that that's a big problem that we don't have a plan. We don't have a way to test this. We don't have like a quality set up for
Mm-hmm.
this transitionary piece, which is crazy and kind of frustrating. There is just like random, it's not random. That's not to say that there's not a lot going on because there is a lot going on. Like there's so much everybody's talking about it. There are people that are like building plans and like Tom works for a solar car company and
Tom, your boyfriend, just for
Tom's
anyone
my
who
boyfriend. Yeah.
knows. Yeah.
Um, and there's sustainable businesses out there and there is the global like the Green New Deal and there's like some
Right.
policy, but there's no integrated goal,
Right.
which I mean, could we Could we expect there to be?
Right. Yeah, I don't know how there could be. I mean, I think that
Like,
it
yeah.
seems like the Green New Deal is an attempt at that, but it
Yeah, but then, you know, it's
it
it's political.
right, implementing that in individual states will be really problematic because we're still absolutely up against a pretty major political player in the fossil fuel industry that certainly doesn't want to
Right. They
give
have
up any
they have
control. They have
no interest in this.
no, no, right.
Yeah. And they have so much control. So
Yeah.
then it's like, okay, well, what can we do? What can we see? What is so then it goes back to what does the data say that we're at and what we need to do. Then I found this really interesting article called The Critical Role of Buildings because I keep reading this about the like building sector and I wanted to know more about what that was. And like one of the biggest emissions is from just buildings that we have. Like 30% of emissions and 55% of global electricity consumption is from like the building sector. Like
Is that the process of building or is that just the existence of buildings in
the
general?
existence of buildings that are not, especially buildings that are not energy efficient. Like, I'll give you an example. This house, we are doing a lot to make it more energy efficient and less energy intensive.
Hmm.
And like, it wasn't insulated at all.
Right.
So anytime there's heat on, it would just leave. Like, there's
Right.
millions of houses like that. There's millions of buildings that they're just one thing that they're not insulated.
Right. Right.
Like that is such a huge amount of our emissions.
That's
Like literally
interesting. Yeah.
30%.
Because things are so cheaply made and
Yeah.
cities
And they
are,
just didn't
yeah.
know.
Right. Yeah.
Really
Right.
old houses, like they didn't know about insulation or insulating materials. They definitely didn't know about emissions. Like, you
Right.
know,
Single pane window versus like double pane windows
yeah,
probably didn't even exist
no, even
until like
50
our
years ago,
lifetime. Yeah.
you know? Yeah. I mean, shit, when this house was built, they didn't even have a toilet in the house. Like, but there's hundreds and hundreds of houses here,
Yeah.
all of which are from the same state, and you're in the same state. Maven is stuck somewhere. She's barking. Um, so it's fat.
Hmm.
That was a fascinating thing to me. And then to see like
Yeah.
55% of global electricity consumption comes from your houses. So this is where it comes to like get a house, like make sure that you're doing things like putting in insulation in your house and switching to LED lights. Like those things actually make a huge difference. And then they talked about heat pumps. They cut typical energy use for heating by a factor of 4 or more. Um, so the quote from this says, waiting another 10 years to act on high performance buildings construction and renovations would result in more than 2 gigatons of additional CO2 emissions.
Oh,
Shitloads.
that's a ton.
Because, yeah, because actually, one of the things that we should be doing is focusing on like bettering the infrastructure that we have. There's so much emphasis put on transitioning towards solar and
Hmm.
transitioning like away from fossil fuels and like making these massive changes. But
Hmm.
actually, one of the biggest problems that we have is that we're inefficient. We're not
Right.
using the energy that we're using well. So now you're just going to
Mm.
transition to this other thing.
That's very interesting. Well, who to, I mean, that makes perfect sense because it's like energy companies don't want you to be energy efficient. They profit on
Right.
your inefficiency.
Right.
So that's a really interesting point to like rather than thinking of like everything in this transition to renewables needs to be like built from scratch. We have to start from the like ground up. It's
Right.
like that's
Whole
actually
new
not
infrastructure.
true. Right. There
Like,
are things we can
no.
do within our current
Right.
homes.
Totally. And it's not hard, right? Like we I mean, it's an investment.
Right.
And one of the things is like we should be one of the policy recommendations was making these types of investments low risk to make upgrades more accessible.
Mm-hmm.
Because upgrading your house, like I mean, we luckily we're very new homeowners, but this is something that my partner and I are so dedicated to is this sort of efficiency. Also, it saves you a ton of money.
In the long run, yes, but it's upfront cost, I think, is what
Yeah.
gets folks, right? That like,
Yeah.
yeah,
But that's what this article was about in the critical role of buildings. It was a very long. Um, so it talked about like what the emissions were, what needs to change. It gives policy recommendations. But one of the things is like the upfront investment will pay for itself in less in like a couple of years.
right.
So, and it's calling for cities to do it when they can, because cities pay also subsidies for their citizens to be able to like live in their city or connect to their grid. So, that's something
Hmm.
that I found really interesting was like asking a city or when you're doing a renovation, seeing if you could get a grant or if you could get something like, I'm going to renovate my house. Can I get, I want to put in a heat pump for
Yeah.
our street. Like, is it possible to get some help with that?
Right. Instead of subsidizing like the fossil fuel industry to like do some more research or digging, why don't you subsidize individuals'
Right.
abilities to make their homes more efficient?
Right.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Right. That's an interesting shift. And then
Mm.
the other thing I found really interesting in this is that we'll need is the transition to microgrids. And the microgrid, uh, this is from microgridknowledge.com. It's very official.
Wow.
Um, yes, the definition is a microgrid is a self-sufficient energy system that serves a discrete geographic footprint, like a college campus, a hospital complex, a business center, or a specific neighborhood.
Okay.
So within them, there are one or more types of distributed energies, which can come from solar panels, wind, combined heat and power, like generators, whatever, that produce the power. Um, in addition, many new microgrids contain energy storage,
Hmm.
which I think so essentially there's a microgrid and then it can connect to for a neighborhood and then that microgrid can connect to the larger grid that we all connect with.
Hmm.
And it connects it with the traditional power grid and it shares back and forth.
Hmm.
And one of the main issues with our big power grid is that you can lose power across a whole state really easily. But with when you transition to microgrids, it's called islanding, which
Hmm.
essentially means that like it's a sustainable thing in and of itself. So if this microgrid goes down, or if the traditional, it's actually if the traditional grid goes down, then this island of a microgrid can stay like
Hmm.
sustain because it can sustain itself. And
Hmm.
the idea of microgridding is to have a bunch of microgrids that are independently sustainable,
Yeah.
but that connect with each other so that if that microgrid goes down, then this one
Right.
or
There's a
in
network of
there's a
them.
network or in a case of renewables, if this microgrid has more power and that one is out of power, they can share.
Got it.
So that is interesting. Right now, This is where that money comes in, because right now it's not a plug and play system. The interconnections between the traditional grid and the microgrid, or between microgrids, aren't standardized yet.
Right.
And they just haven't figured out the tech yet, or like how to make it work really fast, because they need more funding. But in the past couple of years, there has been policies put in place that, sorry, it just makes me so mad, that they're standardization policies, so that interconnections between grids have to be standardized, or they're not allowed to be put into place. But this is new tech and doesn't have a standardization yet. There aren't rules around it yet. So
Hmm.
basically, in order to create that standardization, they need both funding and like a pardon from these policies to be able to grow this microgrid tech.
Interesting,
Uh,
interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's like, who did that?
Yeah.
I wonder who put that policy in.
Right. Right. Like, because in theory, it's not a bad thing to say, like, yeah, this needs to be, there needs to be a standard here. But yeah, for some, budding tech that doesn't yet have the
Right.
ability to fall within your previously created rules,
Right.
how can that start
How do
playing?
you do that?
You can't be a part. Yeah, you're just like by
You're
default
not allowed.
excluding any new potential technology from even existing or trying to
Exactly.
exist. Yeah.
Exactly, which is also like that, tips into energy storage, because again, it has to be standardized. And like I started to look into energy storage, and essentially it's like a bunch of when you start looking into it, you basically find companies that have massive batteries,
Mhm.
that have like big banks of batteries, or you find like a bunch of like potential conceptual information, which, yeah, or like cars being part of the grid, which is a really cool idea. Your electric car can plug in and
Oh.
then it becomes part of the grid, so it's sharing energy around a around what essentially would be a microgrid. Then you're in this like cycle, which is really cool. This cycle of like microgrid, and then you have your car plugged in, and then like the car charges, but it doesn't take a full 8 hours to charge. So, but let's say it's going to be plugged in for 8 hours. You would
Mhm.
say like, I need my car again at 6 a.m., and you plug it in later, or like at 7 it's 7 p.m., you get home from work, you need it again at 6 or whatever, then it would be on that charger for 11 hours, but it only takes 4 hours to charge. So it would be like sharing and just part of the grid, storing
Hmm.
some energy, sharing some energy. This is like potentially possible, but the policies aren't there, and the policies that are in place make it difficult for this type of tech to happen.
Right. That's interesting. Because, yeah, like, where would, like, once a battery is charged, if you have something continuously plugged in, where does that energy actually go? Is it just wasted
Yep.
currently? Right.
Yep.
But yeah, there's no way for it to like go back. Yeah, so that's sort of what they're trying to develop is like, yeah, a way for excess.
Yep.
Yeah, but then it's like, yeah, that then the capacity of individual electronics and things has to come into play and or be a factor of like, how do they know when something is fully charged?
Right.
I don't know that. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. There's somebody out there developing that stuff, but that's
Yeah.
the whole thing, right? Is that there's people and startups and like businesses and random policies and all of these things, but they're not connected. There is no plan. Like
Hmm.
no one's in charge. No, and like everybody's like, we gotta just make the switch. You
Right.
know, it's a shit mess.
It is. It is. Yes,
Yeah.
it is.
That's the stuff I learned.
Okay. Yeah. My
It's good and bad, you know?
Um, yeah, I think that there honestly just kind of needs to be like a nationwide organization that kind of leads the way. I think that that's the issue with a lot of movements is that there isn't a centralized like leader to look to for
Yeah.
answers and for
Who would
like
that even be? I mean, shouldn't that my question is, shouldn't that be the government?
right, right.
Isn't that what a government actually does?
In theory, and that's really where this intersectionality between energy and power and government comes into play, and that was a little bit in what I researched, um, because as of right now they're thoroughly tied because the
Mhm.
fossil fuel industry has been able to, without any regulation whatsoever, just like fund into in politicians in any size election
Yeah.
and been able to put people in power that they like or that they can control, right?
Yeah.
And the
Thanks, Citizens United.
right. Yeah. So it's now it's a political game now where you have to figure out how to gain more political power. And so I spent some time researching the concept of energy democracy. Um, and it it's interesting that like it, it need yeah I mean you can't look at energy without looking at politics, I suppose. And like it is just really, it's a hard game to play because corrupt politicians are everywhere. And there has to, something's got to give, right? I think Citizens United is a really good example. I think it's like you can't, we can't expect to have clean energy solutions without clean election solutions. And that is separate, but so like
Mhm.
that's not what energy democracy is actually about. It's not necessarily about like removing corporate funding from elections, though I think it probably should have that connection. It isn't quite about that yet. It's really more so a concept of democratizing energy, and similar to the kind of microgrid
Okay.
example that you were talking about. It's like there it's removing the commodification of energy, and it's rather and rather thinking of it as a right. It's part of the commons, like education.
Okay.
It's like it's community owned, community controlled energy organizations.
Okay.
And
That does seem microgritty.
yeah, it sort of is, right? Because there certainly needs to be a system in place that allows these systems to communicate like a
Mhm.
network. Um yeah, but
Yeah, but
it's that's kind of like down the line, I think.
yeah.
Because it's not
So
happening yet. Yeah.
is it like yeah, it's not happening yet, but is it like oh man, like the Michael Tallinger One Small Town
Yeah.
where uh, everybody kind of in a community works together and then because they're working together and they're creating energy it is something that they share within their town?
Yes, I think yes. It is a specific focus on just taking the power away from these energy corporations and putting in place renewables in local communities and ensuring that the power that they produce within that community is
Okay.
is managed by
Belongs to
people
the
that are
yeah.
also in that community.
And what about my question always goes back to storage
Mhm.
because I hear you about like this interconnection has to happen later. Like that seems like a down the line thing, but I don't think it can be, right? Like especially if they're transitioning 100% to renewables or they want to.
It seems like the logistics of how it would happen once renewables are in put in place isn't the focus right now. The focus right now is really educating folks on the ability, like knowing that this structure could even exist.
Yeah.
Like we're at
Yeah.
the let's rethink this as a concept phase right now.
I think that those people, can we like find a way to connect those people with the microgrid people? The
Right.
microgrid people are funded by California. Like that's a California
Okay.
thing.
So what's
Also, microgrids have existed for a long time because
yes,
that's what hospitals run on, for instance. So if the power goes out, the hospital stays on.
right. They have
Like
generators, they have backup systems, right?
they
And
have their own power grid.
interestingly, a lot of this kind of this co-op structure of community-owned, community-controlled organizations isn't new. And what I found out, I actually listened to a talk. It was a webinar that was put on by Island Press and the Security and Sustainability Forum. Um,
Cool.
Specifically with this woman named Denise Fairchild, who was an editor of the book titled Energy Democracy.
Cool.
So it was an awesome, it's on YouTube. It was, yeah, it was like a 2 hour or so webinar all about energy democracy. And there were a few different people that gave presentations kind of from their perspective. And one of them spoke about the history of these electric cooperatives that
That's a word I've never heard of.
yeah, so
Electric cooperative.
it's a co-op, right? So that is an idea that they are really kind of revitalizing with this energy democracy movement. But it turns out that this concept is not new. That is actually it was developed in 1934 by FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, and it was really meant to because at the time, energy companies didn't want to spend the money to create and build the infrastructure to power super rural areas of the
Right.
country. And they just didn't. So power companies were focused on cities. They really were like, it's not even worth it to get involved with the rural
Right.
areas. And so these rural and often more poverty stricken areas um, were left without power. And so FDR set up this piece where they would build local cooperatives that brought in the local community. They built the infrastructure and they ran it themselves.
Okay.
But in the 30s,
It's
so like
like
in
pause.
theory, cool,
I
cool, cool.
I love the pause for like think about how cool that is for a second. I'm gonna
Yeah.
ruin it for you now. Like
Well, because in the 30s, um, there people of color were not treated as whole human beings,
no,
and
literally legally they weren't.
we're
Right.
literally legally not whole human
Right.
beings. So the electric cooperatives, essentially, what that technically means is that when you're if you're paying into an electric cooperative, you are part owner and you can vote and you can be in control of the decision-making process.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Um, but
Fuck.
African Americans were left out entirely of the power structure. Like the people in charge
Okay.
were immediately white men. It was 1934.
Yep.
That's the only type of human that was thought to be capable of running anything at that time, unfortunately. So
Right.
that's so though these have existed, these electric cooperatives, and it's interestingly enough, they're still 93% of persistent poverty stricken counties in the United States are serviced by electric cooperatives. 93%. Like
Now,
currently. Yes.
but they're connected to the power grid,
They
right?
are. Yeah, yeah, yeah. They are
So
because
they're
they're still
connected to the
technically
power grid.
using fossil fuels. It's not renewable whatsoever. It's not tied to renewable energy at all.
But
Yeah.
could it be self-supporting if in those places? I mean, it started
It
self-supporting, right?
started
So
by it did. I don't know right now if it could be self-supporting. But because it's been so long where the communities have it's sort of been treated as if it wasn't even a thing, these energy cooperatives. They really, really banked on the fact that the community would have no education that they were actually a part owner of these cooperatives. There was
of
no
course they did.
education. There was no one knew
No one even
that
told them.
no one told them that, because that was the interesting thing. This nonprofit organization that was a part of this presentation was saying, like, okay, this is interesting because now we, in this energy democracy ideal, we want
Yeah,
to focus on these cooperatives.
cooperatives, yeah.
Oh, snap. They're already happening.
Yeah,
Why are we not why are they still run like a traditional like corporation?
because of white guys.
Because of white men who, so they investigated and they found that the community just had no clue
I mean, that
about
makes
the ownership
sense, right?
structure. Yeah, they had no idea that they were part owner and that they could take a part in these conversations that were happening. And
So
it,
when you say 93%, what is that in terms of raw numbers? What is that like?
I don't
Do you
know.
Okay, I
Yeah,
was like,
it was specifically persistent poverty counties of the United States. So she was specifically from Mississippi,
okay.
and nine, like, was something that the percentage was even higher actually in Mississippi, um, for the amount of power that came from electric cooperatives. Interesting.
Seems
Yeah,
like there's like money owed there in some way, you
there's
know?
a breakdown. I don't know if it's
There's
a
there
yeah,
like I don't know if it's a money thing, but like if
it's a
you own
power
a power
thing for damn
grid,
sure. Yeah.
if there's something.
Yeah. Right. And what I don't yet know is sort of like, okay, in the current times, like what actual decision making abilities does an electric cooperative have? And I don't have that information. That's not super
I think
available.
that would depend on the co-op and the
I
place
agree.
and like
Right.
what, yeah.
Right. But essentially, yeah, they found out that just like the public doesn't know that they actually kind of did have more power, like
Do
decision making
technically.
power, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, so it's such an interesting thing because energy is such like poverty stricken areas are also, they bear the greatest burden in terms of cost versus actual usage.
Mm-hmm.
And
And if when it comes to again like the this efficiency and this intensity, like these poverty-stricken areas, especially you said persistent poverty, so
yeah,
there was never a time when they were like built with efficiency in mind. It was like
mm-mm,
started with shanty towns
yeah,
in areas like Mississippi where like it's a metal like
sheet,
plank or
right?
whatever, a
Yeah,
sheet.
it
Yeah,
is.
you
Absolutely.
know.
Yeah, that
Mm,
they never had the ability to think about energy efficiency. It's
right.
always, yeah, and right. And these are also areas that bear the greatest burden of energy related health issues.
Yep.
And so really the premise of energy,
Environmental pollution
yes,
and like
exactly.
destruction and yeah, yeah, Jesus. Man,
There's a lot of work to be done, and it is just interesting and also completely unsurprising
right.
that the people in power um, have for so long just really banked on the fact that the communities are not being educated on the decision making power that they had. Um,
So frustrating.
it is, yeah, it's wild.
There's so many parts of this discussion that have been so deeply frustrating.
Hmm. Hmm. Right. How can we, yeah, how can we like begin? It's like every time we begin making progress, it's like, oh, that was already done. Like, thank you, New Deal, FDR, all of that shit was co-opted by the people who were already in power just to kind of
Mhm.
like they just, yeah.
Yeah, they
And
don't want change. They
right.
like
So it's fascinating to now be hitting that again with this kind of Green New Deal and
yeah,
this premise of energy democracy. Um, but really, the biggest differentiator is that people of color are really at the center of this movement. I suppose that it's that like and labor unions also, which
that's
is
great.
awesome. Yeah.
That's much better, yeah.
Yeah. So and that's really when that it has to happen. That actually kind of has to be the way that it is in order for it to be a truly just and sustainable transition away from fossil food
Yeah.
fuel usage and into renewables and with these new structures of power with energy and energy democracy is really just one way of looking at it, whether or not that actually like comes to be a thing in America, will time will tell. But regardless, it I think it is entirely necessary that the
Mhm.
transition to renewables be thought of through a social and economic and environmental justice lens.
I completely agree with you. I
And
also think like all of these things are that we've talked about are like beginning stages of a plan. Like energy democracy can't be the norm if we don't make a plan to all do it. Like if we said to like if Tom and I were like, okay, we're gonna turn Noonan into an energy democracy. And then we did it for Noonan, and now all of a sudden, like here we are, but we're surrounded by this traditional grid that isn't taking part in that structure. Actually, what we've done is create a new inefficiency. Like
mhm,
it really has to be a whole basically at this point global
yeah,
plan of what's the best thing to do. What
mhm,
and we need to like choose one and just go with it,
right,
and do
right,
all of it. We need the electric cars, we need the building updates, we need the microgrids, we need the like battery storage,
mhm,
whether it's in big container ships or it's in the middle of nowhere. We need all of these things, but right now we're just kind of like building them, and then we're like,
Mhm.
we'll see what works, and then maybe we'll connect them later. Like that's
Right. It is, but it's so short-sighted because it's like we're kind of letting the current powers that be steer the ship.
Yep.
And
We're
that
thinking through that lens. We're thinking
exactly.
through the lens of like biofuel, fossil fuels, like this is how things have to go. There isn't
Right.
anybody that's moving out of this like infrastructure box,
Mhm. Right, that's
you
real,
know?
yeah, no, and the concept of decommodifying energy is so fucking radical that, like, that's a whole thing, but
That's a
it
whole but it
the
shouldn't be. There's so many things that are radical that just really shouldn't be considered
right,
radical.
is it not
We need
radical?
radical decisions, y'all. We
It's
need radical
right.
shit to happen.
I think it's radical that, like, there's just billions of plastic bags all over the place. Like that shit's fucking radical. Like what are we do? Like what are we? Why is everything made of plastic?
Yes.
Like that's radical. But
Why is everything made out of a byproduct of something that we pull from thousands of feet
oh
into the in
my
the
god.
ground, right? Like,
Right. That whole yeah, right. And we're so entrenched in that way of thinking
right.
that anything else seems wild and completely unrealistic,
Yeah,
but
but
that's not the truth of the
yeah,
matter. It's just a big shift
no.
and
It's just inertia. It's
yeah.
just like we have been barreling forward with fossil fuels and like all the things that they can do, which is like cool, right?
Mhm.
It's actually cool science. It's cool tech. It's like, the minds that are on fossil fuel creation is actually really interesting if you do separate that industry out, which we tried to do. The fossil fuel industry just sucks and they just do fucked up shit all the time.
Yeah.
But like the science behind it and the engineering behind it is so technical and so cool.
Yeah,
But
but
like,
science and engineering is dope regardless. Put that
right,
fucking money into other shit and that would also be cool,
right,
Like
exactly. Like you don't, no scientist that I have ever met is like, I'm gonna spend my whole life doing something that focused on creating something that's gonna run out. Nobody I know, no science like when a scientist creates their like little baby thing that they love, they would prefer that it goes on forever, right? Like that's their namesake, or that's the thing they've worked 25 years on this like little thing.
Mhm.
And like, what did we just watch? Tom likes math stuff.
Okay.
He he turned on a math YouTube video about pi the other day. We were just like people figuring out pi, which
Okay.
for me miss me, but I
I was
like
gonna say.
just like miss me with math YouTube. I don't know, but like
I'm glad it exists, but like I'm good.
I'm okay with it. But it was actually really interesting how people figured out pi was literally like using like um circles and squares, and how many circles will fit in a square, and then adding different sides so you get to like a 20-sided circle die, or a sunny 20 or a 50-sided one, and then however many parts of that were was another number of pi. So there was this mathematician that literally spent his whole life figuring out like 20 or 25 numbers of pi, physically figuring it out, right? And he
Mhm.
put he put the damn thing on his gravestone, because like that's what he
Mhm.
dedicated his entire life to.
Right.
And then and these scientists that are doing this, it's the same with the fossil fuel industry or the solar industry. Like there's people out there that are dedicating their lives to the science behind all of this stuff. And
Yeah.
it's fascinating. But I don't know any scientist, new scientist that's like, good morning, this is my first day being a scientist. Let's just go put all my energy to run out of fossil fuels,
Into a
right? Like,
technology that was developed in the 20s. Yeah,
like
right. That's interesting. Right. I mean,
right.
I would, it would be naive of me to believe that scientists are like, you know, values over profit, but they're still individuals and they need to make a living. And the
Oh
fossil
yeah,
fuel industry pays pretty well for scientists to be developing ways that they can make
sure.
more money. So,
But they're
frick.
developing ways to make things more efficient, right? Like at this point, a fossil fuel scientist is actually probably figuring out a way to make the individual, like gas or whatever,
Mhm.
work more, work
I don't
harder, be
know.
more
I mean, yeah,
efficient.
probably. Yeah, that's one aspect of it, just so that they can continue selling their product, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. But
Yeah, but it's still a method of efficiency, right? Like
yeah.
that's part of the transition you don't hear about. People are like, let's just stop using fossil fuels. And it's like,
Mhm.
actually, I'm not necessarily completely for that. I mean, eventually, absolutely, yes,
We can. Yeah,
if we
yeah.
can. But I think also putting our time and energy into making what we do use in fossil fuels more efficient
Mm,
is something that like didn't really find a whole lot of information about,
mm,
like that I would like to know about. Like
hmm.
what technology is going into like this gallon of gas and making this gallon of gas last longer.
Right, right. Yeah. I mean, they're certainly developing things. Yeah. Yeah, but it's not
It's unclear.
widely available information, I suppose. But yeah, it is a very, very interesting thing. Yeah, I think it is. I think it is naive to say let's transition tomorrow because yeah, it kind of can't. Yeah, it can't
You
be.
can't.
Right. We have to think.
Yeah.
Yeah, we live in a very highly complex society where um, energy is a necessary part of our existence. So, yeah, it is. There has to be some broad, overarching um, pieces of legislation that really
Yeah.
kind of lead the way nationally, but also have statewide and local um,
Yeah.
ordinances, also, I suppose, or that are involving state and local governments as well.
Yeah.
Um,
And there has to be money behind it. There has to be
mhm,
infrastructure creation behind it. And
mhm.
which I mean, I think means, especially as energy is concerned, trying to get our government to divest in fossil fuels
Yeah.
and transition that money into like even just improving the efficiency of the buildings of the cities.
Yeah. Right. And the base level of that is is electing people into power who have our own values in mind, right?
Mhm.
And a lot of these independent little nonprofit organizations that are kind of tied to the energy democracy movement are doing just that, where they're really all of their energy and attention is going into like leadership training for Indigenous people of color,
Interesting.
um, immigrant communities as well, so that they can feel empowered to even sit at the table, and have these conversations and feel like they could be a decision maker within their community. And if they feel
Wow.
compelled, they could, run for an elected position.
Yeah. Is there a way to donate to that
Um,
to
I
like
can find out. I will find out, and most certainly, yes. I don't have the organization site up right now, but I'll do some digging and we'll definitely put it in the description.
yeah.
Um,
We're
yeah,
doing some research into finding the right causes for us to invest in. We're at a place in our business in a really cool way that like we can give back some.
Mhm.
So we're looking for the right company, and that sounds
Yeah.
cool.
It was very cool. Yeah, it was actually like it was an Asian American organization dedicated to energy democracy, which I'm doubly interested in supporting. So, um, totally, yeah.
That's
But
great.
that was just an interesting thing that it was sort of like, gosh, that seems like that's though that's cool. It's like we're at that very first step, in actually being
Yeah.
able to start making transitions that take um
Mhm.
that give people who have traditionally been on the peripheral of decision making, and really giving them a role and
Yeah.
a leadership role in the transition. I think that's really
Yeah.
where I want to focus, because I think those are the communities that have not only bared the brunt of all of the bullshit, but I think have just uh they just fucking deserve it. They deserve
Yeah.
to be the ones
Yeah,
making
they
decisions.
have the resilience and they have the
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah.
Say, when this happens, because it's not going to be a beautiful transition. It's a
No.
transition that has to happen. It's going to be ugly, folks. Like,
Yeah.
we're human, so we're going to procrastinate the shit out of this
Yep.
in reality. And then there's going to be a bunch of power outages. People are going to flip out, and then eventually things are going to be okay, like a few years later. But like, those those people, when we elect the groups of people that have been dealing with those exact issues for the past 100 years, they're
Mhm.
going to know exactly this how to lead this transition. When they say like, okay, the power's out, this is what we need. Like, the power's out over here, all right, we need to direct it over here. We need to make sure our hospitals stay afloat
Mhm.
and our firefighters have what they need. They know how to make sure that their communities stay safe, even when they're dealing with these energy emergencies, because we're going to deal with energy emergencies.
Yeah.
So I think that's awesome. I think that's
Yeah.
great.
Yeah. So, yeah, I will definitely put links to all of the organizations that were a part of that webinar. It was really, really eye-opening and really cool. And it was cool to just see how different nonprofits were, um, I guess, just like what they were each independently focusing on in order to
Super
kind of all
cool.
get to the same end goal. Yeah. Very, very cool concept. Yeah, I mean,
Lots to think about on that one.
yeah. Yeah, but
I I have
it's
so
just
many
so
questions.
cool to see how many people are like, this is their jobs, is that they're like running these organizations. And so it was really, really inspiring. And
Great.
yeah, yeah,
I feel like
they're
what I learned was not as inspiring. That's great to feel like there there are people doing things, but it feels also good that there are people that are helping make a plan because or trying to,
yeah,
or
they're still
you
so,
know,
they're disconnected though, which I think is a big
how
concern.
can we help this systems integrate? How can we do that?
Yeah, I think I don't know the answer to that, because that's like the
That's
crux
the
of
question.
issues
Yeah.
with nonprofit organizations, is that they operate independently, and
Yeah.
though they're all doing great work, how can that make more broad sweeping changes?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that's why we operate Living Brand Directory because it's the same with sustainable businesses in general. Is like
Mhm.
everybody's so busy working on how to make the world a better place for like in
A
their
singular
way.
worldview, right? Yeah.
Yeah. That
Hmm.
they forget that they don't have a way to communicate and like share that vision to make it easier
I know.
outwardly.
We need like a varying sizes of sustainability networks of people, of organizations, and I don't know the answer, but there is
Yeah.
a need for that. That's for
Yeah.
sure. Yeah. We'll
Well,
see.
we're gonna
And
have
maybe it exists. Maybe it
it
exists,
might
and
exist.
like the sustain, like or like the sourcing when we were digging into
Like the
sourcing,
supply side one, man.
right? Like
Yeah,
it's totally possible that something like that does exist and just like isn't, you know,
they're
doesn't
just not very good at SEO.
their website is hard to find, right? And yeah, as we know, yeah, people are busy, so right, how can these organizations even know that there's something that
Yeah.
they could tap into? Um,
Maybe we should try to find somebody. I mean, we can talk to Tom because he
yeah.
about energy, but I think it also would be interesting to talk to somebody that maybe does something like that.
Yeah, interestingly on if any of you guys use the Clubhouse app, there's a lot of conversations about sustainability on it, um, and I think that they're really um, they're well organized because um, there are so many specific things that you can talk about, but it's like the ones at least that I've seen have done a good job at kind of um, I guess communicating the intricacies of these of the issue. And there definitely have been some folks who have started following on there that I think work for really dope organizations that I think we could definitely kind of get in touch with. So yeah,
Cool.
open to that.
Yeah. So we have a book we're gonna read, and I don't have it pulled up right now. Um, for
I don't
next week.
either. Energy something. Let's see.
Uh, 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 uh.
Let's see. The
It is called The
carbon
Carbon
boycott.
Boycott. Oh, yeah,
Mhm.
by Samuel Avery.
Path to freedom from fossil fuels. Ooh.
Yes. Okay, so maybe this will give us even more answers. That's cool. Excited about that. So I think we'll talk about that next week, right? Like this book that we're gonna read.
Yeah.
We're we're using Libro FM. This is a non-spawn. Um, but like instead of using Audible, we switched to Libro because we want to like support local bookstores. And so every time we talk about books, I think we should just say support local bookstores,
Yeah.
and like Libro.fm is great for that.
It sure is. And yes, this is non-spawn. We might put a link in the bio that
Oh, yeah.
we can definitely refer a friend.
Oh, yeah. We should refer people here. That's a good
Yeah.
idea.
Yeah. So we'll put a link there that you guys can click because it is very, very cool. It is a Audible competitor, same price on a monthly basis as Audible, but a portion of the proceeds go to local independent bookstores, and that is dope. Good.
That's really cool.
Um, what's his face? Jeff Bezos doesn't need any more of your money, so let's not give him more.
No, but independent bookstore owners, that's there's a human face behind there, and they've been struggling, I think, especially through Corona time. And like,
I can't
if
even
yeah,
imagine. Yeah. Yeah.
I know. Oh my God, to go to a bookstore.
A used bookstore.
I would love to go to a bookstore.
I haven't been to a bookstore in a long time. Yeah. Oh boy. Well, yeah. So this will definitely be an interesting topic as we kind of dive further into it because I definitely think it'll be it'll be less depressing than last month.
Let's just like hope.
It will be because there's so many organizations doing really, really, really cool things, and
Yeah,
every
true.
little bit helps in just kind of like having this conversation
Yeah,
anywhere and everywhere that you can helps.
helps.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's on all of us.
Hmm. And so if you vibe with that, then subscribe to this channel.
Yeah, because we talk about this kind of stuff all the time,
Sure do.
every
Yeah.
week.
Yep. So learn along with us. join in the fun.
Yeah.
We'll be back next week.
Yeah. See you then.
Thanks for watching, everybody.
Have a great
See you
day.
next time. Bye.
Bye.